Imagine you were forced to watch as your childhood friend was forced and coerced by someone into killing countless people, and worst of all, they're doing it in your body, and you are unable to stop them. After almost 4 years, we finally have new Deltarune content, and not only has it brought new memes, incredible music and this TV guy, but it has also doubled down on elements seen in previous chapters, yet in a way that is so disturbingly terrifying. And so in this video essay I'll be analysing the horror of the players controlling Deltarune, and also presenting my own theory at the end of what it actually might mean for the rest of the game. Also, spoiler warning for Undertale and Deltarune, obviously. Upon starting Deltarune, you're greeted with a view of the soul. This soul is meant to represent us as the player, something I'll discuss more heavily later on. We go through an ominous sequence of choosing parts of a body, and we create a vessel, shaping its mind and personality until then. It's discarded, instead being told that our name is Kris, before then being introduced to Kris as the character we play as. Yet Kris is their own person, with their own name that we can't choose in their own life, as we can see by the game starting with Kris waking up like any other day. So we immediately get the idea that Kris is an actual person, but you still assume nothing of it since that's how most games are, right? Surely they aren't aware someone's controlling them. Now this idea is left for pretty much the rest of the chapter as you control Kris throughout the school segment, and again we get glimpses into Kris having their own life before this. However, in the Dark Worlds you see something strange. Kris has their own save file, and we save over it at the start of the game. And this is really important as it supports the idea that Kris has their own identity and life before us, and us coming in and saving over it shows how we're taking over their agency and autonomy. But then for the rest of the Dark World, Kris just carries out our actions acting like a vessel for us. However, in Hometown, speaking to everyone, you get more glimpses into Kris's own life. However, this could just be written off as backstory. Surely they aren't actually their own person. Yet then you get to the end of the game and... you are not Kris, and Kris is not you. By Kris's more sluggish movements, we can see that they need the soul to survive, also confirming that the soul is the player as you can control it in the cage. This scene confirms to us that Kris is separate from the player. They are their own person with their own life. It's also a scary idea. Imagine you have your own life, but suddenly some entity in a reality beyond your comprehension suddenly takes over your body, yet you're still conscious of it. And Kris here shows that they're aware of being controlled. And in a way, this is similar to how the player exists in another game called One Shot, where while you do control the character Nico and play as Nico throughout the game, in the world of the game, the player exists as a god, who guides Nico through the world. And so the control of the playable character Nico is meant to be us guiding them. But this is very unique from any other game you play, as in most other games, the player and the playable character are one and the same. Your actions are the character's actions, and so when this idea is challenged, not only is it really immersive, but it is also really terrifying. Anyway, all this is to say that the separation between the player and the playable character is important to understand what I'm going to be saying about Kris and Deltarune itself. Chapter 2 carries straight on from the morning of the previous chapter, in which the soul is no longer in the cage and Kris is being woken up by Toriel. And chapter 2 really dives into the themes of control and free will, far more than chapter 1 does, with a whole separate route dedicated to the idea of the separation between Kris and the player. In the Dark World of this chapter we see something strange. Once again, in between chapters, Kris has their own save file that we again write over, and this implies a struggle for control over Kris between us, the player, and Kris themselves. And this struggle for freedom from control is something we see explored in this chapter. The cyberworld is pretty normal at the start, with again Kris acting like a vessel for the will of us, the player, not really resisting our input. That is until Kris is separated from the party, leaving just us and Kris. From here things can go two different ways. You play this part normally like a normal person, or you do the weird route. And look, I know why you clicked on this video. And now after all that build up in establishing Kris and their relationship with the player, I can now properly explain the weird route. The weird route honestly did not feel real back when chapter 2 first came out. It felt like some weird myth, yet against all odds it was real. There is a really visceral fear that comes from the idea of a game breaking. That these rules of the game that we thought were so rigid are now shattered and anything could be possible. These characters that you grow familiar with are all made to do horrible things, and it all looks like some creepypasta you'd see buried on an early 2000s internet forum. Kris makes it through the cyber city until encountering Noelle. She then joins the party, and this is where you can begin the weird route. It's all normal until you encounter an enemy, and to do the route you as the player order Noelle to use the Ice Shock ability to freeze every enemy. Now normally when you kill an enemy in Deltarune they just run away, with it not really having a larger impact over the story. Yet here the enemy is frozen solid. Their dead corpses litter the cyber city, and as you freeze more and more enemies, their corpses still linger, acting as a constant reminder that you are doing this terrible thing, where you can distance yourself from it because you don't see the full consequences of your actions. You do this until you reach the advertisement for a Ferris wheel, where another aspect of this route shows itself. saying I will ride with Noelle, when she clearly wants to go with Susie. She plays it off as a joke, but then you choose to say, Noelle will ride with me. Noelle is taken aback before then saying to herself, since when did Kris get so... No way, it's gotta be some kind of prank. This part is uncomfortable seeing how forceful the dialogue is, and the use of the pronouns I and me give off a very commanding tone. From here the route turns darker. You speak to the Addison who asks if you're interested in new dating shoes, to which Noelle firmly denies this, even questioning if she's even so much as friends with Kris, to which the player then says, we're something else. Noelle is shocked before then the music cuts, and the Addison offers us a freeze ring. Noelle is against it at first, but then the Addison says she needs it to get stronger. Then as the player we choose to get it, yet the price is just $1 more than what you have. But we choose get it again, and again, until Noelle is confused in disbelief, as she realises what we're asking her to do, until... Immediately after, Noelle convinces herself that nothing happens. A silence fills the air as all the NPCs are gone. You then do a puzzle and Noelle debates to herself whether it was right about what she did, and to stop thinking about killing Kris, to which us, hearing her thoughts, respond saying, it's natural. From here the music goes to a slowed down and creepy version of the Cyber City area theme, again giving a creepypasta horror to it, as though the game is breaking due to our actions, and we see that Noelle is now scared and broken. This is one of the more disturbing aspects of the weird route, the way that Noelle is manipulated into killing on our behalf, and it's just sad to see, especially seeing how happy and uplifted Noelle is in other parts of the game, and to have her broken like this just gives a deep sorrow that is hard to describe. From here things only get more disturbing, as instead of encountering funny cutscenes like you would normally, it's replaced by more enemies, more freezing, more becoming stronger. NPCs that would previously appear leave their places empty, again giving the sense that the game is breaking. The actions of us, the player, has been so cruel to where the game is falling apart around us. You freeze more enemies and now they begin to run from you, scared of the monster that you've turned Noelle into. Seeing the empty city filled with frozen corpses fills you with an uneasy dread. You then freeze more and more enemies until you reach another puzzle, and this time it's even creepier. Noelle seems really nervous and unsure of what to do, and so all you say is, proceed. She seems confused before you again say, proceed. Kris approaches Noelle closer and closer, making her more nervous, before you again say, proceed. Until Noelle is then backed up fully next to the laser, and then... She then thinks to herself, rationalising Kris's actions, not knowing that it's the actions of the player and not Kris, saying that we were just making her stronger. From here you continue walking through the barren city, devoid of any NPCs or light-hearted relief. The game feels broken, like you're walking through a test map before any of the other features have been coded in, and you reach the next puzzle area, where again you see Noelle trying to rationalise to herself everything that has happened, saying that it's fine because she's learning and getting stronger, yet she seems to forget what happened when getting the ring, or solving the puzzle, and she doesn't want to remember. Maybe because she doesn't want to admit what's happening is bad. She doesn't want to admit that Kris might be a bad person for making her do these things. She says how the battles are blending together, and that if Kris tells her to do it, she can do things she never could before. This implies that the player has some power that can change and influence people, since she doesn't know that these orders are coming from us, and not Kris. With the last enemies completely frozen, you backtrack all the way to Spamton's dumpster and get the thorn ring. You then progress forward and see Birdley. Birdley acts normal, unaware of what has happened, yet Noelle has now changed, saying, Kris, it looks like another enemy. It's disturbing the impact we've had on Noelle, to give her this much disregard for the life of others. Noelle then finally does recognise Birdley, and say that her and Kris are just getting stronger, and all we respond when confronted is, proceed. It then escalates into a fight, and Noelle now has a new spell called Snowgrave. So you gather enough TP to use it, but Noelle says she doesn't know that spell, but you keep insisting, until... Birdley is now frozen in ice, and Noelle, blocking out what just happened, wanders off. The rest of the chapter is then heavily altered. Segments you play in a normal playthrough are now skipped past, and the story is now heavily altered. Queen's mansion is taken over by a strange force, that being Spamton. Anyway, the whole chapter is so disrupted that Queen just gives up after Rowsley talks to her, and then things seem to be calm again. But Noelle is still missing, locking herself in her room. So you go to the fountain and... Spamton thanks you, as because of what you did, he is now able to become Neo. You then fight Spamton until a certain point in the fight where his defense increases to the point where Kris's attacks become useless. And so your only option is to act. Kris calls Rowsley for help, but nobody came. So they then try to call Susie for help, but nobody came. Until then, you whispered, Noel's name. You then return to the light world where you see Birdley lying with his head on the desk, not moving. To call this route disturbing is an understatement, and this is very important context for later chapters, as what happens here lays the foundations of way more sinister things to come. This route perfectly shows the horror of the player's control, as not only are you controlling Kris and making them do bad actions, but in doing so you're making Noel also do terrible things, to the point where it leads to Birdley getting injured, and at the end where the game makes the distinction between Kris calling out for help, and you whispering Noel's name, and this shows that the player is a separate entity in the game, and it's also just so creepy. Could you imagine if you were taken over by someone from a higher level of reality, and then not only do you have your agency and free will taken away, but they also use this control to hurt the people you care about, but they do it in your body, and worst of all, everyone thinks that you're the one that's behind it all. This is one of the most disturbing parts of Deltarune, and we see this idea expanded upon throughout the game. If Undertale shows the horror of being aware you exist as a character inside of a video game, then Deltarune shows the horror of being aware you're the player character being controlled inside of a video game. Now I've kinda made this video seem like it's only about the weird route, partly because it makes for a better title than Weird Rant About the Player and Meta-Narrative of Deltarune, but I also will be exploring the aspects of Kris's relationship with us, the player, and I think there's one less example of this in Chapter 2 that would be stupid not to go through. Whilst playing Chapter 2, normally you end up encountering Spamton, and he says that he knows something that Kris wants, this hyperlink blocked. Spamton is heavily associated with freedom. It's something he yearns for, being desperate to cut himself from his own strings, and this is something that Kris seems to resonate with. Kris has some sort of unique link with Spamton, with them being alone almost every single time they interact with Spamton, and after beating Spamton Neo, Spamton realises that he can't cut his own strings, saying that he couldn't be anything more than a simple puppet. And this really resonates with Kris, who freaks the fuck out, with Susie asking them if they're okay, and they respond by yelling, showing that Kris is really freaked out because just like Spamton, they too are held back by strings, with the strings being us the player. And this scene has another layer of discomfort, when you realise that even in seeming unsettled by seeing someone unable to break free from their own strings, Kris still can't voice their own opinion, as we the player decide the response to Susie asking if Kris is okay or not, which would make sense why Kris yells or says it in a strained voice, even when we choose no, because while we do have the power over what they say or do, Kris ultimately chooses how that is expressed, something which is heavily relevant later on. Overall though, Spamton Neo acts as a mirror to Kris in their own situation, both being held back by strings, and just like Spamton, Kris is nothing more than a simple puppet, as even after the fight we choose what they say as a response. Then at the end of this chapter, Kris and Susie go around hometown together, and go to the piano in the hospital. Kris has been known to be good at playing the piano. They fail and look frustrated. I'm sure this won't be relevant later. Kris then takes out their soul twice, one in the bathroom to jump out the window. I'm sure this won't be relevant later. Then they take out their soul another time and create a dark fountain, which takes us into chapter 3. Hey, if you've watched this far, make sure to subscribe. These video essays take a lot of time and it really helps me out. Please? Yeah, okay, cheers. Enjoy the rest. Now chapter 3 doesn't have as much relating to the player's control compared to the other chapters, except for a few smaller things that I'll go through now. The main way that horror and control is shown in this chapter is through the game's console, where Kris, Susie and Rolsey play an old school NES style game, with each character having their own controller to control their character. This idea is then subverted in the second game, where after Tenna leaves, Susie swaps controllers with Kris, so that they can solve the puzzle. However, in doing so, Susie then also controls Kris. Wow, someone taking control over Kris and making them hug Rolsey with Kris having no say or input on what happens. This sounds familiar, I wonder what this could be a parallel to. Susie then swaps controllers again, this time giving Rolsey control over Kris, to which Rolsey is nervous as for once he has to make his own decisions. This is a pretty minor part, but I think it's cool to see that once again this idea of Kris being controlled against their will is explored, and in a way that we can experience it firsthand, as we as the player get to watch someone else control Kris. But there is more of the NES games that's related to the weird route and the player's control, and that is in the Shadow Mantle secret game you play in the S-Rank room. This room is meant to be creepy and uncomfortable, however when booting up the game the room is lit up by the glow of the old monitor, and as it boots up we see the soul that represents us, the player, before then loading in and showing it inside of the body of Kris. This mirrors the opening of chapter 1 with the soul on a black background before then introducing us to Kris. This game is weird and unsettling, with it being the map from earlier, yet this time Kris is alone and has a sword, so you go around killing every single monster that spawns in to make Kris level up. And there's a theory that this is meant to represent the monsters from Undertale that you kill in the No Mercy route. In one of the rooms you can see the text, "Become stronger," with this likely referring to Noel becoming stronger in the weird route. Anyway, after reaching max level you can break through the trees to get the ice key, before then the console switches off. Then the second game in the Shadow Mantle quest gets more disturbing. Once again it loads in with the view of the soul before then showing it inside Kris. Again you're in an empty version of the game you played previously, with the same enemies as before, so you kill every single enemy on the map and level up, until you gain the ability to break the coral object, which then allows you to go out of bounds into an area previously restricted and blocked off by Tenor. You then see a door which you can unlock with the ice key from earlier, as you then enter the ice palace. This area stands in stark contrast to everywhere else seen in the game, and yet again you see the same enemies that you have to kill to level up. You enter another room and see a blue bird blocking off one of the pathways, and so you again kill more enemies and level up. As you explore more and more, you then enter a room with the text, "The forbidden path began with ice magic." I wonder what this could be referencing. Anyway, now at the max level, you break your way into the next room, and you see a figure in a white cloak, immune to being attacked. Yet upon leaving the room, they follow you, now a member of your party. They give you the power of ice magic, where upon attacking it causes this figure to freeze the enemies similar to the weird route, so you go and freeze more enemies and solve puzzles, eventually reaching the blue bird, which you then freeze and progress onwards. All of this directly mirrors the weird route, the ice magic referencing the ice shock ability, and then the blue bird represents how Birdly got frozen, and it is really creepy the fact that it so coldly references it, especially how dehumanized or de-deronized Noelle is presented in this, being shown more as a tool through which the ice magic is carried out through, which just creates a really uncomfortable feeling. You then go through a sort of maze puzzle before then you reach another door, but it's locked, before then saying, "The ice key was used up. She was used up." Suddenly the door opens and you enter a black void. A strange voice begins to speak to you. Then when progressing further you get the shelter key, to which the voice thanks Kris for all their hard work. Before then, you were used up. Okay, so what did this all mean? Well, first, I think the ice key being used up is more just standard narration, and I don't think it's implying something and more just setting up the structure for the following line, "She was used up," with the fact that the figure disappears after this implying that this line is referring to Noelle on the weird route. "She was used up" is after you, the player, made her do those horrible things and kill people, was left to be deeply disturbed by it, which we can see by how freaked out she is in the hospital cutscene after the Dark World in Chapter 2. The language used here is also very transactional and dehumanizing, representing how Noelle was used up by the player to break the game and enact horrific actions. Then "you were used up" could be referring to either you, the player, or Kris. However, I feel this line most likely refers to Kris, as it's also who the voice is referring to. So this may again imply more about our control over Kris, and how they are also used up by us, the player, as we see them as a vessel through which we interact with the game world, with it being very dehumanizing since the player doesn't let Kris be their own person. We choose their actions, we choose what they say, we even choose whether or not they manipulate their friend into hurting people. And that's what's so scary about the ideas that Deltarune presents. The fact that some entity beyond your comprehension has control over your every action, and in a way that is so dehumanizing and with a lack of regard for you or your friends. And the fact that they can make you do these horrible things, but because they're doing it in your body, people will think it's your actions. Something we again see as Noelle is terrified of Kris after the weird route in Chapter 2. After this you progress through the chapter normally, with there not being much else relating to the player's control or any other horror elements. That is until you go back to the green room. It's empty with a depressing blue layer all over, with somber music playing in the background. You then enter the S-rank room and see Ramp, who is almost fully turned to stone, and have set up one final game for Kris to play. Again it loads in with the same view of the soul representing the player, before then showing it inside Kris. It looks to be a city, and this time the game is different, as you have Susie and Rousey following you as part of the party. But where are all the enemies to kill? Everywhere's empty and there's nothing to kill except... Kris looks away in horror, and you can't really blame them as watching your two close friends be killed by you is pretty disturbing. After this you can go to a previously blocked off area, and it takes you down an alleyway, one that is exactly the same as the one we went down after snowgraving Birdly in the weird route, again linking this secret boss route to the weird route in Chapter 2. You then go through a manhole and enter a creepy basement. This basement is similar to the basement in which you fight Spamton Neo, with similar songs playing in the background, with this being a more 8-bit version of the song playing in the Spamton basement. It all feels really ominous, and you once again fight and kill enemies repeatedly to level up. Anyway, upon reaching max level, you break down the trees and enter a hallway, with Tenor talking reflectively about Spamton abandoning him. He then gets surprised that Kris is there, and says that he did what they said. But what did Kris do? Well, with Tenor blocking the way, the only way to proceed is to kill him. And what's strange is that Kris doesn't look away like when killing Susie or Rousey, suggesting that they don't care for Tenor. You then enter the video game version of the shelter from the light world, and inside it's once again creepy and ominous. A strange voice then speaks to Kris, asking them if it's fun what they're doing, and saying that's why they're looking for the shadow crystals and shadow mantle, and asking if they think it'll get them what they want, before then saying that part of them is enjoying this, and if you did the weird route it says the same part of them that enjoyed yesterday, implying that there is something more sinister to Kris. Anyway, you then fight the secret boss, that the community has dubbed John Mantle. I think this whole series of secret games links back to the same sense of horror created in Chapter 2 with the weird route. The whole idea of the rules and comfort of a game breaking and a secret darker pathway existing below the surface, which we see in these games. As while it is similar to what we play with Tenor, it's more disturbing and darker. I think it also gives us more of an insight into Kris, as after defeating John Mantle, they say that Kris has red flickering in their eyes that they can't hide, before then saying without play the knife grows dull, which implies that there's something more sinister inside of Kris. This may refer to us, the player, or that Kris has done something terrible in their past, and may have a dark side to them. Regardless of that though, the player's control is one that is even more prevalent in this part of the chapter, but still, are we a friend inside them or a foe? And that's something explored perfectly in Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is the most stuff referring to the player's control over Kris, with various things linking heavily to it and the separation between Kris and the player. This chapter also continues the weird route in the light world, with it being even more disturbing than in Chapter 2. When talking to Noelle in the church, you compliment her, and she's confused on why you did, and then says that she doesn't think Kris had complimented her before, and saying that she missed hearing Kris play piano. This shows that Noelle can sense that something is wrong with Kris. However, to truly see this, we need to talk about what happens at Noelle's house. But before you do go to Noelle's house, you first head to Castletown, in which you see the new rooms of Tenor and Queen, but also you see Ralsei's room, which is empty and desolate, as Ralsei felt that darkness like him shouldn't have their own wants or identity due to being fictional. However, that opinion is starting to change, and so Ralsei asks Kris if the darkness should feel like they have their own identity, to which you, the player, have two choices, one good and one bad. If you choose the choice of course not, Kris only says of course and covers it with a yawn, showing that they do care about Ralsei and that they're resisting the player's control. And this idea of Kris resisting what we make them do in order to stop their friends' feelings from getting hurt is something we see repeatedly throughout the chapter. Anyway, after this you then go to Noelle's house. Now depending on if you did the weird route or not, two vastly different events can play out. However, for now I'll leave covering the weird route until later on. And as you walk around and look at things, Noelle shares stories about what Kris was like when they were younger, again giving the idea that they have their own life and identity which we've taken over. You also see a piano in the house which Noelle says no one really plays it anymore. Anyway, one Among Us reference later, and Susie distracts Noelle so you can look for clues about the code to the shelter. So you enter the room of Noelle's missing sister, Des, and you see a guitar which you inspect. A code is there and you begin to read it until... Kris then takes us to the vent room and places us in a gift box. For some reason they don't want us getting the code to the shelter. However, you can still control and move around the soul, and so you enter the vent and float around the holiday house. It's a really creepy and liminal feeling to be seeing this place that you've only just gotten semi-familiar with, yet in a way that is so distant and outside in perspective. And as you float through the vents you feel with a haunting and emptiness that few games can match. That is until you enter the kitchen and see Kris getting orders from the phone, with someone telling them that Susie must not get the guitar. This explains why Kris has been acting so strange when not controlled by us. They have their own mission and seem to be working against us and Susie. However, I still wouldn't say that they're evil, but I'll touch more on that later. You then enter the kitchen more and Kris attacks you and returns you to the vent room. However, when returning back to the kitchen, one of the most beautiful moments in the game occurs. Kris wanders over out of frame, and suddenly you begin to hear soft piano playing. After a long time of being controlled by us, the player, growing frustrated not being able to play and growing upset at our control, Kris can finally play the piano, and it's really beautiful. Whilst they need the soul to function, for just this brief moment, Kris is free, and the piano amazingly represents that, and the fact that it's all played live on real pianos really adds to that realistic feeling. All this is to say is that this moment, while small, is one that really makes you feel for Kris. Imagine if you were controlled against your will, and the one thing you love the most you're unable to do no matter how hard you try. It'd be soul crushing. Oh god, could you tell how much I love this game in this moment? Anyway, after this you turn off the lights, freak out Noelle and Susie, and then find yourself stuck inside an angel sculpture on a table. You then escape from this and can now move freely around the house, with the only open door being the door to Des's room, and so you enter. It seems normal but also eerie, and so you head to the guitar and... Kris then grabs us, and Noelle and Susie hear, so Kris hides in the closet. Susie and Noelle then sit and begin to talk about Noelle's dream, with the dream actually just being the Chapter 2 Dark World. Anyway, in this conversation we actually learn more about Kris. She says that she ended up in a large city with Kris, but saying that they didn't act like their normal self, and actually acting like they act recently, which makes sense given that we've been controlling them for the last few days. However, Susie says that Kris seems normal to her, and this sets up a sad conflict in the story, as all Susie has ever known is the Kris under the player's control. She has no idea what they're actually like and no idea that they're even being controlled, and for Kris this must also hurt. The fact that Susie isn't friends with Kris, but instead friends with the version of Kris being puppeted, to say things they don't want to say and do things they don't want to do. Then as the conversation progresses, Noelle says that Kris kept looking at her like they wanted to say something, and everything they said sounded odd. Yet again to Susie it seems normal. After this you then get attacked by Kris, and Susie finds them in the closet, and Noelle then wants Susie to play the guitar. Kris then calls the mysterious person on the phone who says they'll be right over, and Kris replaces the soul before then. This again shows that without the soul they are weak, and need it to function, which is scary because while they so desperately want to be free from us, they can't as they need us. Then after more conversation and playing guitar, Noelle's mother then enters and tells Susie to leave. Then after this, Kris leaves Dessa's room and heads out the door, until Carol approaches saying, "You are always welcome here," and many people think that you being in red refers to the player, which would imply a lot about Carol that would be a whole other can of worms to get into. Anyway, after this you enter the Dark World for chapter 4, in which you're confronted by the Night. Anyway, there are parts of this Dark World that have a certain creepiness to it. I think the most obvious example is this worship room, where there is a circle of people around another one petrified in stone, or other areas where it's just deeply surreal, but the vibes of this chapter is amazing and far different from anything else in Deltarune. After this, an idea is then built up in the Jack fight, where you can use the power of the soul, that being the player, to create light and is essential to beating this boss. The idea of the soul being a separate entity is also used throughout, like in the Coerced secret boss where Susie asks Kris to help her out, obviously referring to the player's soul being used to defend against attacks like we can also see in chapter 1. After this, you then reach a room with a lone giant organ piano in the centre. You try to play it but it doesn't sound right, and you need to find what notes to play on it. So after Susie gets the notes you then try to play them again, but it still doesn't sound right. Susie then says to Kris that Toriel said that they used to play good, and Susie doesn't know why they're pretending they can't. And so instead of us playing, Kris begins to play instead, with the text saying, "Your hands began to move on their own," and then Kris plays the piano. And this scene is just really powerful. Kris, after being so desperate to be free and play piano again, now is able to play again, and everything I said about the piano earlier also applies here. Then shenanigans with the night happens and then they seal the fountain. Kris and Susie are now back in the light world, and Susie opens up about her experiences with pianos and how people treated her badly, to which Kris can respond to, and you can choose a good or bad response. So if you choose, "I'll never play again," Kris covers it with a cough. However, on the weird route, Kris takes it one step further. This part is just really disturbing, and we can see the cruel impact that we're having over Kris, to where they have to resort to harming themselves just to resist our control. The fact that Kris has to go to more of an extreme in the weird route to resist us may suggest that we're gaining more control over them in the weird route. Overall though, this part really adds to the creepiness and horror of the weird route. Susie then opens another fountain, and you go to the second sanctuary, a distorted and inverted version of the Dark World from before. Yet also in this Dark World are more pieces of the prophecy, with one of them being the ominous line, "The first hero, the cage with human soul and parts." Now this line is referring to Kris, it is creepily accurate to their situation. They're a cage for us the player, as they are trapped in this horrendous circumstance of being in a metaphorical cage, being forced to carry out the player's will. This could also be referring to the vessel, which also adds another layer of horror, with the idea of a person being made up and constructed to fit the will of the creator, with none of their own agency. Another point of horror in Deltarune is the egg room, being found with a Yume Nikki-like random event by going in and out of a room. And just the way it feels like the game or reality is breaking as you glitch your way into the space in between fills me with a fear that's hard to describe. In the almost 7 years that Deltarune has been out, the egg room has always been really unnerving for me, and it again goes back to that idea from the weird route of a game breaking and things that shouldn't be happening do happen, as the rules of the world break, leaving you freaked out. Another way Deltarune creates horror is the use of darkness in chapter 4, like when you're chased by the strange creature or when you have to fight Gersten's statue. This fear of the dark idea is also mentioned by Ralsei near the end of the chapter. As the chapter draws to a close, you reach the final area, where you walk through a dark hallway being attacked by the night, and yet when all seems hopeless, it's the soul that lights the way and guides the party through this dangerous moment. The soul and the light of the soul is also very important in the fights after this as well, as whilst fighting the Titan spawn you use the light of the soul to destroy the projectiles, and then use it to end the fight by banishing and purifying them. This is heavily prevalent in the Titan fight, with it mainly relying on the light of the soul to unleash its power to allow the party to damage the Titan, and then also at the end where Susie and Kris jump inside of the Titan, and uses the soul to defeat the Titan entirely. To which Susie then inquires about the soul, which is most likely setting up a heartbreaking scene in later chapters, where Susie learns that the person she's grown close to isn't the person she thought, and the reality is that Kris is being controlled by some strange soul. The chapter then ends with the soul once again in the cage, with us being able to move around in it and Kris rolling around in the bed looking frustrated. We then hear Susie talking to Kris before we then see the end of their conversation. Kris then goes to jump out of the window, until then getting interrupted by the person on the phone saying don't forget. Now this again implies that there is more to Kris and that they may not be evil. At the end of the credits, Gaster speaks directly to us, the player, and that's it for the chapter, if you're playing normally. But now let's go back and talk about the changes the Weird Route made, and how it adds to the horror of Deltarune. Everything is the same until you go to the holiday house, where after Kris removes the soul they encounter Noelle, who wants to talk alone with Kris. So once again they put us in the box, yet now when going through the vent we can see their conversation. Noelle says that she's been waiting to talk to Kris all day. She says she wants to talk about last night. She said that she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes all she could see was snow. She was terrified what happened was real, so she left her house, and then she heard Kris's voice, saying it was all a stupid prank, and that Birdley will get better, and then saying that Kris sounded weak and shaky, and she says it has felt like so long since she's heard it, and then suddenly she asks if she can say something else, and a text box appears, summoning the soul, and so you choose proceed. The soul is now in the room and you retake control over Kris. Noelle then says after Kris said all that, they pulled a thorn out of Noelle's finger, and said when she saw them again to not mention that Kris did any of that, to which Kris then covers her mouth trying to resist the player's control. Noelle is then nervous, and asks who else could hear, to which then this happens. Noelle is now terrified and tries to see if it's another joke, before then recognising the voice as the same one from her dream, to which you then say it wasn't a dream. Noelle, still in disbelief, asks Kris to repeat what they said, scared that they can read her thoughts, to which you then say you heard them. She does more tests to see if they can read her thoughts, not knowing that it's you, the player, controlling Kris and hearing her thoughts. She then says to say that it didn't happen, that it didn't snow, to which you say, it happened. An option then shows up to equip, and you begin to approach Noelle, and Noelle recognises that you're holding the thorn ring. You keep proceeding with Noelle becoming increasingly shocked and terrified, until... Immediately after, we see a blurry view of the bathroom, where Kris stumbles in as they throw the soul into a trash can, and brutally kick it repeatedly, enraged by the actions you have made them do and the harm you've done to Noelle. This is the true horror of Deltarune. Kris was forced to silently watch as their childhood friend was terrified and hurt by some strange entity, and worst of all, they were doing it in Kris's own body. The Weird Route in Chapter 4 takes everything that Chapter 2 did and made it 10 times creepier, doubling down on all of the psychological elements, and using the medium of being a video game to add to the otherworldly horror of this route. One of the creepiest moments has to be where the player reveals their voice to Noelle, and you see a green ethereal glow, as though this presence is not normal. This supernatural force is disrupting the world around it, and this is further supported later on, when Susie asks what you and Noelle were talking about, to which this then happens. This moment is just so oddly haunting and feels like something straight out of a creepypasta, and this part of the game is just so hard to play through, especially the moment at the end of Kris kicking the trash can, as this moment is the culmination of everything in the game so far with the player, as Kris feels angry and hopeless, as they try desperately to protect their friends from you, the player, by sneaking out and telling Noelle it was all a prank. So at the start I also promised to give my theory on what this all actually means, and to be honest I believe that we the player are not controlling Kris, but instead we're controlling the entity that is controlling Kris. Let me explain. In the Weird Route cutscene with Noelle you have the choice of two evil options, but why? You as the player are not inherently evil, and in that scene you have about as much power as Kris, as your only option is to proceed. Furthermore, Noelle mentions that Kris has been acting weird and different for a while, and in the game we've only been controlling Kris for 3 days, but Noelle makes it sound like Kris has not been themselves themselves for months. Another thing that supports this is that in chapter 1, Kris seems pretty experienced with taking the soul out, and stares directly at us, the player, and even knows to use the birdcage to store us. And I don't really think you'd learn all of that on your first day of being possessed. And also the dialogue choices in the game that we choose have a lot of personality to them, and seem to have their own motives and desires that at times are different from us, the player. So while Kris is 100% their own person, separate from the player, the entity controlling them might not directly be the player, and instead some other force. That's as far as I'm willing to speculate though. I'm just saying there is something more to whatever is controlling Kris and what allows the player to influence this world. But to say what exactly, I guess we'll just have to hope that chapter 5 reveals that to us. In 2026, oh my god! Oh, this video was just meant to be more on the shorter side just to get something out, whilst I'm in between 2 massive projects, and trust me, this video could have been way longer. Huge thanks to my channel members like Ghost USA, seriously thank you so much. And if you want to be a channel member, you can get early access to new video essays and progress updates on future ones. Speaking of, if you like Deltarune, then you will love my video essay, The Horror of Escapism. Not only do I talk about Deltarune, but I also talk about Yume Nikki and Omori, and it's probably the best thing I've ever made. Also, once again, thanks to Darkworld Rotzi for doing the pixel art of the music transitions in this video. Anyway, I'll see you again one day for an extra special video essay. Thanks for watching.